Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, it wasn't another Katrina, but Hurricane Ida was bad enough, and even worse in some areas of southeast Louisiana. We'll look at the weather phenomenon and what we learned for the future. We'll also examine the storm's path and the dangers of heat when the electricity goes out, plus another blow for the restaurant industry, already staggering from COVID. There are new discoveries from a murder in Houston of a New Orleans police officer and his friend we'll examine. And if the world doesn't already seem upside down, the Saints open their regular season as the home team against the Green Bay Packers, not in the Dome, but in Jacksonville. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources, Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. And from the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate, Mark Schliefsein, environmental reporter. Ian McNulty, food writer. And Ramon Antonio Vargas, the staff writer. All right, guys, it's good to see everybody. I know you three have been really, really busy these past couple of weeks with this storm, and we're going to start, though, to discuss the storm with Errol. Over to you.
You know, it came to mind last Sunday night as the storm was coming through. Reminded me of that night in 2005 when it was a Monday night when Katrina hit New Orleans. And, you know, for most of the day, it looked like we did okay. You know, some trees knocked down, nothing really major, except for a fire at the Southern Yacht Club. It looked like the city had survived. And I remember that night being upstate in Marksville and like listening to the radio and listening to people, the WWL and people talking, feeling pretty good about things. And all of a sudden, the announcement came in, the word was out, that the levees had been broken and New Orleans was flooding. And the world changed right at that moment, right at that announcement. And the future of the city for the next few years and maybe into the future and it was this combination of things looking okay and then all of a sudden this horrible announcement. And I thought about it last Sunday night is, again, the electricity was out in most places, but nothing really major, but listening to radio, things seemed to be going okay. Then the announcement came that a transformer tower, which I didn't even know we had a transformer tower, right, had fallen into the river with carrying 8 lines, which affected all of Orleans Parish and 90% of Jefferson Parish. That was one of those moments that reminded me of the levee breaking moments. And it seemed terrible. I mean, and we didn't know what that meant, but we knew what it meant. It wouldn't be good, and would this mean New Orleans would be without power for weeks or months or whatever it was going to be a disaster. I mean, it took a while to find out that they were able to recover from it better than we thought. But it was that same sort of experience. From good news came this terrible announcement. And for all the criticism that Energy is getting, whoever organized the effort to get all those people out there working and fixing things up and getting all those trucks in town and getting all those workers, I think they deserve some credit for being able to do that. But the big picture is that tonight, South Louisiana, which for the easy definition is everything south of I-10, is a little bit limping tonight. You know, from New Orleans all the way across to the west, and even once you get to the Lake Charles area, which is still recovering from a hurricane a year ago, and still has a long way to go. So there's a lot of damage throughout South Louisiana. Even though I got to say, one person on staff tonight who lives in Franklin said that all they got was a drizzle, even though nearby Morgan City got it pretty bad. But you look where the worst damage was. Well, first of all, you could divide the damage, the affected areas into the New Orleans immediate area. And New Orleans immediate area did okay. It was mostly electrical outages. The real damage was, I guess, is what you'd call lower southeast Louisiana, starting at Grand Isle and then going up to Bayou to Raceland and to Houma and then to Laplace and all the horror stories. And so in understanding, you got to look at some areas. This area was really bad. This area just got by. But there was a lot of concern. I mean, there's an indefinite amount of issues that come out of this, but a couple that come to mind, maybe for future preparation, is trying to re-examine and doing something about the whole situation with nursing homes. Because some of the saddest, most pathetic stories that we've heard this past week has been what happened in nursing homes. And we know that's a problem. We know it's out there. We know we're dealing with vulnerable people who are very immobile. But we just have to do better in terms of the preparation. We had some of those issues with Katrina, and some of those people were in hospitals, not even in nursing homes. But there's just got to be some kind of a new policy developed. Another area that we're seeing more and more problems with is generators, and people being asphyxiated from generators. And I think probably what's happened is that there are more and more places that are selling home generators and more people who don't know what to do with it. We saw several examples of that, and there needs to be a new policy on that. And then the ongoing issue is, what about Grand Isle? Grand Isle is always a bullseye for a disaster. It's a barrier island out in the ocean. It's a wonderful place, but man, some kind of tough policy decisions have to be made. And the final thing I just wanted to mention is that I heard during the week, actually on radio, Michael Heck being interviewed. He's the head of the New Orleans Foundation, or Greater New Orleans
Foundation.
GNO
Inc.
Yeah,
GNO Inc.
Greater New Orleans Foundation. And,
GNO Inc., not the foundation, but okay, go ahead.
And he said that he was asked, would this really hurt the New Orleans image over a long time? And he was pointing out that in those first few days, he was getting a lot of calls from the national media, but then they stopped. And he thinks what happened is that this didn't generate the kind of pictures that Katrina did. There were no pictures of people on the roof. I mean, there was no pictures of flooding over a big area. So what the rest of the world saw was typical flooding and electricity. And so they didn't think that there was that much interest globally in terms of doing that. And so in terms of maybe, New Orleans had to go for years with people still thinking it was underwater, maybe we'll have less of that.
Yeah, of course, shortly after Ida passed over us, she went up the Northeast, and we saw a lot of flooding there. That caught the global interest, that's for sure, up in New York City.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's get over to Mark right now, because Hurricane Ida, this thing just blew up and became this really ferocious, fierce storm. Is this our future?
That's a really good question, and it's a debatable question. The reality is that we are pretty much seeing the same number of storms in the Atlantic Basin over time as we have over the last 100 years. The problem is that they keep hitting South Louisiana, especially in the last couple of decades, and that's that's a significant problem. There are things about this storm that are directly related to climate change. The first one would be storm surge, where you have both a combination of sea level rise and subsidence along Louisiana's coast. We're already missing 2,000 square miles of wetlands that could have buffered this storm. And a good place for that to be seen is where the storm came ashore at Port Fourchon. It then went over open water until it hit Galliano, and it really did not reduce in intensity during that time, and that's a result of the fact that all those wetlands are disappearing. And that's going to continue to occur throughout this century and will continue to increase our risk. So that's one thing. The other is that it's clear that hurricanes are capturing more moisture and delivering it as rainfall, which is what happened in Laplace, St. John Parish, where there you got the 1-2 punch of both the rainfall and the storm surge coming from Lake Pontchartrain, causing major problems in that area. There was 17 inches of rain there. And a lot of that fell in just a couple of hours. So it's, that's a huge problem for communities that aren't used to that kind of rainfall. The other thing, of course, is the wind and how this storm moved as it came ashore, and the fact that it didn't lose intensity before it came ashore. And there are conflicting arguments by scientists about whether or not there's a breakdown that's occurring of the jet stream during the months of hurricane season that allows these storms to be captured and brought north without losing their intensity. The other issue is the intensity that this storm got fairly quickly, that rapid intensification. That's both as a result of the fact that the Gulf of Mexico is warmer because of climate change, but more for this storm because it went over a piece of the loop current that broke off from the Gulf Stream and was floating around in the Gulf of Mexico, and it went over, and that's deep water, basically acting like you've turned up the burner underneath a pot of boiling water. So you add those all together and you have a significant storm. Was this storm as bad as Katrina, the storm itself? No. Katrina was a wider, more intense storm. It was a Category 5 for a much longer period when it was offshore before it dropped to a Category 3. It came in such a path that its storm surge was not was significant for Louisiana, and the result was that we had failures of levees because they were improperly built. But the key issue is that the storm surge of that storm was 28 feet on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. We didn't have that kind of storm surge in Louisiana from Ida. On the West Bank, new West Bank levees built after Katrina, you had maybe 4.5 feet of water, which would have saved that area. That area was saved by the new levees, most definitely, but those new levees are 11 and 12 feet high, so they were not really in danger. And the rest of the system, it was a good test of the way to open and close gates and things like that, but there was not really a significant test of the levee system by this surge. It was, you know, maybe as high in some places as Katrina's surge was, but the levee system itself is significantly higher all around to deal with more intense storms than what we saw before Katrina.
And so with the climate change and what's happening with climate change, what I'm hearing you say is that we still need to do better in being prepared.
Absolutely. In all cases, I think one of the real issues that Louisiana is going to have to face is what to do with all of those communities that are outside these 100-year levee systems, the 1% levee systems, like Lafitte, where they had a 7-foot high levee that was nowhere near high enough to deal with the storm surge from this storm. And there are other areas that other communities that are outside these levee systems that are going to have to make a decision on whether or not they stay or leave over the next 50 to 100 years.
Yeah, and we haven't even touched on the issue of power, and that's going to have to come up, I guess, for another discussion.
Yeah.
That, too, of course, really brought us to our knees for the past week in the metro areas having no power. All righty, Mark, thanks a lot. I'm going to move on over now to Ramon. And, you know, no power, no electricity in August summers in Louisiana. Hot, hot, hot. It also could be deadly.
Yes, according to, it's a combination of information from the Orleans Parish Coroner's Office and the Louisiana Department of Health. Indications are that at least 10 people died, most likely because of heat in the wake of Hurricane Ida, which obviously knocked out power to virtually the entire Orleans and Jefferson Parish area. Seven of the deaths that are suspected of occurring because of heat amid the extended power outage. I mean, there's most of the area is going to be back by tonight, but obviously some areas took several days to come back, and so those are going to include apartment complexes that primarily tend to elderly residents. 7 of the people who died that they for reasons possibly related to heat are going to be in those complexes or were in those complexes. Another 3 died in residences or complexes that are don't exclusively tend to or primarily tend to elderly residents. That includes one person. It particularly has shook me. One resident who, Laura Bergerall, New Orleans photographer, who spoke, who I met through Press Club of New Orleans and my involvement there over the years, and reached out to me about wanting to get out of the city ahead of time. Shared her, she was still here to get ahead of the storm. She was still here the night before landfall. You know, it became clear that her window to leave had closed, so she tried to ride the storm out. Here, very hot apartment complex that didn't have power for several days, and she ended up passing away and they believe that she is one of the 10 to die because of heat following amid the extended power outages. Obviously, it rattled the tightly knit New Orleans Twitter community, and anyone who knew her personally, including some of us in the media here through Press Club of New Orleans. So I think that illustrates when people say, I mean, it's particularly because it's, you know, I grew up obviously during the I've seen the clips during the coverage of the 1972 terrorist attack at the Olympics. that the newscaster said, that seldom do your worst fears or greatest dreams come true. And this was in real time. A lot of us saw someone's worst fears come true. Somebody was nervous about the storm and ends up dying alone in their apartment complex. I think particularly tough pill to swallow for people trying to rebuild.
Oh, that is very tough, Ramon. I'm so sorry for your own personal loss there with your friend. It's just been so extremely difficult for this community over these past couple of weeks, and even worse for folks south of us who are continuing to really, really struggle. Okay, Ramon, thanks a lot. Ian, talking about struggling. Restaurants, again, brought to their knees because of this. So we have restaurant problems, but also we lost some important people.
Yes, that's right. In the midst of the turmoil after the hurricane, the everyday losses and struggles of life continue. And so this week we mourned 3 people that intersected quite closely with the food world. One was Will Samuels, in recent years best known as the creator and personality behind the King Cake Hub, that magnificently fun piece of New Orleans king cake culture. But of course, Will has been known for many years throughout the city for his many different business ventures in food and entertainment, and for his great leadership and contributions to the Jewish community in particular. Just so many different realms and worlds intersected through the light and spirit that shone out of Will Samuels. And we really saw a lot of feedback from that when people learned that he died at age 52 from cancer, quite tragic and young. Across town in Mid-City, WYES' restaurant on Bienville Street, it's mourning the loss of co-owner Frank Bordelon II. He's seen there with his wife Lori, who survives him. Frank died just 2 days after Hurricane Ida hit. He was at the hospital and he died from complications from surgery, his family tells me. He was 73, and he was somebody that if you walked into WYES' restaurant on Bienville Street, he was going to be there, grinning at you next to one of those icy cold bulbous schooners of beer. He's a guy who grew up in the Mid-City, grew up in that realm. His mother had bought WYES' from previous owners and brought it into the family. Yeah. Just a great guy, great character, great example of the characters who run through our New Orleans restaurants. The Bordelon family tells me they will reopen WYES'. They plan to do that next week. And then Mike REGUA, longtime chef at Antoine's restaurant. He was the executive chef there for many years, but also he worked at Antoine's for 47 years before retiring in 2019. He took up the mantle from the previous chef, John DeVille, who had worked there for 48 years. So you see the longevity that runs through the careers at Antoine's here. Okay. And Mike died just the other day.
Our condolences to their families. And let me have you now quickly touch on what is this doing to our restaurant industry?
Sure. The restaurants sprang back to action with remarkable speed under harrowing circumstances. I mean, you saw restaurant operators cooking in the dark sometimes. Very often you saw them just opening up their cupboards to the community for whatever people needed and could use. That was the immediate response. That's the can-do that this community has. But right now they're going to have to assess how they get past the next phase because, as you noted, they've been run through the ringer of the pandemic for over a year and a half. Things were looking better. Delta variant was making things look very much worse. Yeah. The scrubbing of the festival season was a huge impact that happened just before Ida hit. And for the last, let's say, dozen days, nobody in the restaurant business has done much business at all. And that includes people who make their living on tips and hourly workers who have not had shifts during all that time. So the restaurants are coming back very, very quickly now. Most restaurants in the city are back open, and the ones that do not haven't planned to reopen next week. So they're there. They're going to be very glad to see you. But they definitely took a tough financial blow for this at a time when they needed it the least. So looking for some help from them, hopefully from their insurers, from Small Business Association, from programs that can help them get past this phase and continue with their long-range recovery from all they've been through. But just remember, they were here for us. Some of the first places to snap back to action in harrowing circumstances right after Ida. It was a beautiful thing to see.
You mentioned that schooner of beer over at Liuz's. Boy, in the dead of August, that really sounds like a good thing, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Nice, cold, ice cold beer. Okay, thanks a lot. And Ramon, let's go on over to you. And, this happened before the storm hit, and so much has gone on these past days with the storm. Everybody concerned about it, but this is still a very serious and sad thing that happened with the murder of a New Orleans police officer and his Zulu member friend. Two of them members of Zulu gone to Houston, and then they were both shot to death.
Yes, they were vacationing, and obviously in the early aftermath of when the information hits that a New Orleans homicide. He was Everett Briscoe is the officer that we're referring to, and he spent the bulk of his career investigating homicides. Shot to death outside of a restaurant. There's a lot of questions flying. Tons of rumors and speculation about what might have happened, and fast forwarding later, you find out that Houston authorities have since gone public with their with what they strongly suspect believe happened, and they were just the targets of a random robbery attempt. They were eating dinner outside of a nice restaurant in the Galleria area, which obviously is going to be a busy, relatively upscale area of Houston. And Detective Briscoe's friend, DJ Riculfi, had a nice watch on him, and he had a New Orleans Saints jersey, and the guys they just happened to come across the path of what they believe to be a crew looking to rob people of nice jewelry. And so there's a jewelry store near where they're eating, and he's got a nice watch. And so they decided, he's got a pretty clear indication that he might be from out of town. And they just thought it would be an easy mark. And they approach Briscoe and Riculfi's group, tell them to put their hands up. And this is according to one of the people who has since been arrested. What they told detectives, and this came out in a court hearing, is that one of the would-be robbers saw possibly someone maybe reaching for a gun. There's officers there. There's former military there among the people among the group of people who were approached to be robbed, and that maybe they saw one of them go for a gun, or they saw a gun and became spooked, started firing. Detective Briscoe was struck and dies at the scene. Riculfi is taken to a hospital and stays there for several days before he is removed from life support and dies. Both men were fathers. Both men leave behind widows, and obviously working for the police. Riculfi was a local business owner, and he a livery company, a bus rental company, and a tuxedo rental company, and both through their association with Zulu are going to be connected across the city. Obviously, their loss was a massively traumatic thing for this community, right in the lead up to Hurricane Ida. So those people are going through a double whammy right now.
And there have been arrests.
Yes, three people total have been arrested. Nobody, it seems like the early scramble is to try to draw a distinction between who fired, who was the getaway driver, and who was just there. In the eyes of the law, obviously the concept of capital murder, felony murder, they call it in some outside of Louisiana. Whatever the case, ultimately having the phrase of being in for a penny, you're in for the pound when you have any role in a criminal act that ends up in somebody being killed. Makes you just as culpable as firing the gun. There's really no legal distinction between that, and that's legally, on the legal side, that's the reality that the people who have been arrested for this are facing. There was a $100,000 reward put up, the bulk of it put up by the restaurant owner who also owns the Houston Rockets, businessman named Tillman Fertitta. It is not clear if that award has been paid out, but authorities have made clear that the fact that it was $100,000 was just an unusually, exceptionally large cash reward produced the first significant tip that led to those arrests.
All right, another terribly sad story and a real loss for our community. Thanks a lot, Ramon. E, over to you. Saints opener, and they're not doing it at home in the Dome.
What's surprising about that, when they made out the schedule looked, it made sense. They're going to open at home, then they're going to be on the road for 2 weeks, and then come back at home. Well, who would have thought that the home opener would be in Jacksonville? And so the Saints really won't play for the first time at home until October. They're going to be on the road for 3 weeks. And that kind of reminds me, I hate to keep comparing to Katrina, but there are so many parallels that that they kind of shifted the schedule around in the Katrina year when the Saints opened, and they played their first few games on the road, and it just looked so dismal for the team because they had a new coach, and a new quarterback, and they'd been playing in San Antonio the year before. And who would have thought that they'd come back and they'd win and get in a winning streak and actually make the playoffs that year? And so it was a really surprising year. They lose in the playoffs, but it was one of their best seasons ever. So maybe we're going to have the same type of movement. We got to get used to a new number now, number 2, which is Jameis Winston. For all those years of pulling for number 9, he'll be starting as quarterback. He was the guy at Florida State. He was the Heisman Trophy winner, and then he was drafted by Tampa Bay. Played for 5 years there, but didn't. He made some great long passes, but he was also intercepted a lot. And they said, well, his play calling was questionable. He was let go by Tampa Bay. Saints picked him up, and he liked the idea of being an understudy for Drew Brees and maybe kind of work on those other problems. Sean Payton, who's a whiz at working with quarterbacks, is obviously impressed. And so we began the Jameis Winston era. People.
So go Saints on Sunday.
Go Saints on Sunday, yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot, E. Stay with you now. Other stories. Errol.
Well, during the last few weeks that the state decided to push back the election calendar. There were some elections that were coming up, miscellaneous elections throughout the state, and so the elections are going to be pushed back to November and December. And again, the same thing happened after Katrina, that the elections were pushed back. That was a much more serious election. That was the mayor's election. They had to be pushed back. So we've done this before.
We have. Okay, thanks a lot, E. Mark, over to you.
Yeah, so I talked to the Coast Guard today for a story that we're running on Monday about an update on the oil spills, and there have been some big numbers that they had put out. They've adjusted that. There are 2,300 targets, quote unquote, that they have been looking at, but there are really only 81 of those that have risen to concern that they're having to follow up with. There are 400 or 500 more that are still being looked at, but seem to be in good shape.
Okay, so we can look for that on Monday, huh?
Yep.
Okie doke. Ian, over to you.
One restaurant of special concern as Ida was blowing through was Middendorf's, given its location out there on the waterfront in Manchac. But confirmed earlier this week with owner Horst Pfeiffer that the restaurant made it through quite good shape. A little bit of damage, but nothing they couldn't fix quickly. Got back open this weekend on generator power. So the mighty Middendorf's is back, and you have to wonder if Horst Pfeiffer was in charge of infrastructure for Entergy, would we have been in the dark all that long?
Really? So thin fried catfish still there. Okay, Ramon, over to you real quick.
A handful of Jefferson Parish schools will be reopening. It's the state's largest school, public school district will be. So a handful of those schools will be reopening September 20th. A few more coming back online September 24th, and the rest coming back October. Most of the rest coming back October 1st. We have the details of the staggered reopening post Ida on NOLA.com and in the newspaper on Saturday.
Difficult for kids. Such disruption. All right, guys. Thanks a lot. It's good to see you all. Thanks for joining us. Thank you all for joining us too. See you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.